Welcome back to another edition of Miller's Movers. It's Tuesday, so we've got the new handicap marks released this morning. But before we get into that, we should look back at a good weekend of racing from the UK and Ireland. We'll start on Friday, where there was a really interesting Newbury card, largely focusing actually around a couple of Paul Nicholls runners. Regent Stroll made his much anticipated novice hurdle debut. Of course, he's an expensive £660,000 purchase from the Chris Giles dispersal sale, kept in the yard by Paul Nicholls with a syndicate made up of, amongst others, Alex Ferguson and Fred Dunn. And he was wickedly impressive. He was pretty keen through the race. He did sort of jump rather exuberantly at his hurdles. He didn't really fiddle very well. And then coming down to the second last, when he needed to fiddle, he made rather muddle of it, landed in a bit of a heap. Most horses, that would have knocked the air out of their lungs and they would have struggled, but I was very impressed with how he jumped straight back on the bridle and cleared away. Jumped the last, probably the best he'd jumped a hurdle. Maybe he just learned from that mistake at the second last. Cleared away for a pretty emphatic win. It looked on paper a pretty decent contest. The runner-up had run well in the Aintree bumper. That has already produced plenty of winners. I think, in fact, the first 6 home the Aintree bumper have all won hurdles already this season. So the form looks decent for all that. I wouldn't want to take too much of a view about it. What I did think was interesting was that in the aftermath, Paul Nicholls said that he was going to go to the Challow hurdle with him. I slightly read that maybe they're going to take a bit of another look at that. The Challow, of course, over the course and distance in early January. And I just wonder whether they might look at the Formby hurdle, slower ground up at Aintree, is around what was the Tolworth at Sandown. That's over 2 miles. Might just suit him better as he's a bit free and he just needs to learn to relax over this trip, I would think, in a better grade. But you'd caveat that with the fact that Harry Cobham would be unlikely to be at Aintree for the Formby hurdle, and it might just be that they want to try and keep that partnership intact. So be interesting to see where they go with him next, but he's a really exciting prospect. Also racing in the same colours, Alex Ferguson's colours for this season for these jointly owned horses was Khalif de Burle. Now, he'd made quite a good impression as a juvenile hurdler last year, winning on his juvenile hurdle at Kempton, where straight away connections mentioned he'd been bought to be a Gold Cup horse. I always think that's a slightly daft thing to say in the aftermath, because you sort of put a target on these horses' back, particularly when they're in a yard as big as Paul Nicholls. But he won another novice hurdle race, or juvenile hurdle race, I should say, last season. Was going over fences, a 4-year-old getting that valuable allowance, and was going well at Carlisle when racing freely and coming down 3 from home. So he was rerouted here. Hadn't had all that much time to recover from that fall, but they said he was back working straight away and had few ill effects from hitting the deck at Carlisle. And he jumped better here. This was over 2 miles. He perhaps, as an odds-on favourite, didn't win as you'd want to see if you took the very short price. But he doesn't jump like a 2-miler. He's a little bit like Ballyburn in that regard. He jumps a little bit up and a bit down. He's not overly quick across his fences, and he fiddled a few. But you can't hold that against him. You know, he might well have been carrying a little bit of a hangover mentally from his fall at Carlisle. He warmed up, and actually, when looking in trouble for jumping 2 out, stayed on really well to the line and won quite cosily. I think they'll keep him in handicap company for the time being. His mark hasn't gone up all that much. He's onto a mark now of 141. There's still handicaps to be won off that mark. They'll bring him along slowly. He's definitely going to stay further in time, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if they keep him at 2 miles on softer ground. That'll make it more of a stamina test. Perhaps just got a bit found out for speed going down to 2 out at Newbury. But Khalif de Burle is certainly a horse I'm going to keep on side, for all that it's a long way to being a Gold Cup winner just yet. And whilst we're talking about horses in this ownership, we should just talk about Coldwell Potter, who made his chasing debut at Carlisle on Sunday. He had an entry at Newbury in the John Frankham novices chase, but Paul Nicholls reported last week that he hadn't been overly happy with how he'd schooled. Not that he jumped badly, just that he was a bit fresh and a bit chancy at a few fences. And that showed at Carlisle, actually. He got a bump at the start and went down to the first with his tail on fire. Took a flyer, jumped out to his left at right-handed Carlisle, which wasn't ideal, but he had far too much class for his rivals. And his jumping, you have to say, was impressive. When he was long, he showed tremendous scope. He really did cover a lot of ground. Wasn't so smart when in tight, and you can see that that's clearly what had been concerning them at home. Does look, unsurprisingly, like a smart move from former multiple champion trainer Paul Nicholls to send him to an easier target. I think they'll look for something similar again. I don't think they'll be in a hurry to up him in grade too readily. And you have to point out he's probably the first horse out of the Coldwell sale to do anything like you would hope. That sale has been a bit of a graveyard. If you purchased there, you'd slightly done your money, but he's got a long way to go for paying back that huge figure. But he did get his chasing career off to a good start. He's clearly got scope. He'd be better going left-handed. He'll like soft ground. He's clearly got plenty of pace, and we knew that. He had a big engine when with Gordon Elliott, but he does need to brush up his jumping when in tight. But he's certainly in the right yard in the country to do that. They do plenty of jumping with him. So Coldwell Potter was destined to head towards the John Frankham Novices Chase at Newbury before diverting to Coldwell. They instead left in Captain T from the Paul Nicholls yard, but really this was all about one horse in the form of the Jukebox Man for Ben Pauling. Ben Jones doing the steering this year. It was Keelan Woods in the saddle last year as a novice hurdler, but Ben Jones has got the #1 gig, and you could see when he crossed the line at Newbury that this was a big opportunity for him. He punched the air as if he'd won the Gold Cup. It clearly had plenty of pressure on him. The Jukebox Man was really impressive with his jumping. Again, very exuberant, very scopy. And in the close stages, did start to get a little bit more nimble with his feet. Wasn't overly impressed by some of the leaps he took. He was quite guessy at a couple, but clearly has got the scope to go with the sort of arrogance of attitude, if you like. But I always saw him as a 3-miler. I was a bit concerned that on this ground, over this 2-mile 4-furlong trip, he might get a bit tap for toe. I got that bang wrong. He had plenty of speed. And conversely, I'm left wondering whether actually he is going to have the stamina for 3 miles. He slightly tied up in the Albert Bartlett last year when looking like having that race at his mercy. And I just wonder if this exuberant nature over fences continues, whether he's going to be able to conserve enough energy to be an efficient horse over a trip of 3 miles. So with the turners gone, that will give them a little bit of a conundrum. They're certainly going to want to do a bit more work on his jumping in terms of just getting him to be neat and sharp, not all the time cashing in big checks and taking big leaps. But he's clearly a very talented horse, plenty of scope, went through the race very easily. And in what looked like quite a competitive race on paper, he won with a great degree of ease. Saturday's UK card featured around Newbury, where the feature race was the Coral Gold Cup, won by Can Do Kid, second season novice, as was the runner-up Broadway Boy. We'd mentioned on the Thursday SBK betting podcast that perhaps this wasn't a vintage renewal, and I think the result bears that out. Can Do Kid, second season novice, which is often the trend you look for, but he's somewhat off being a top class horse. He jumped soundly. He was up in trip for this first try at 3 1/4 miles, and he stayed very well. Broadway Boy lost little in defeat. I'd mentioned on a podcast, or this podcast a couple of weeks ago, that whilst his handicap mark looked fair, I wasn't overly enamoured with him for a big competitive field handicap where I felt he's got a mistake in him. And it was unfortunately a mistake for him 4 out that probably put paid to his chance. It put him on the back foot, having made most of the running, and he could never really quite get back to get alongside Can Do Kid and challenge. He ran a sound race, but both of these are going to struggle to be top class. Quite where you go with Broadway Boy from here on in, I'm not sure. He might be suited by slightly softer ground, but I think he's got to perhaps about the ceiling of his handicap rating. As for the Can Do Kid, they've suggested that he'll go to the Grand National, potentially without a prep race. He's got a mark of 151. I'm just not sure. In years gone by, he probably had the right sort of profile, a progressive young chaser who looks like he'll stay further. But these days, the Grand National is won by quite a classy horse, virtually a Grade 1 chaser, and I'm pretty confident the Can Do Kid is not that. At Newcastle, the Fighting Fifth took centre stage with the clash of the Triumph generation, although he didn't run in the Triumph hurdle, Sir Gino, and the supreme runner-up, Mystical Power. Mystical Power didn't really turn up. He ran no sort of race at all, but Sir Gino was impressive. We spoke on the Thursday podcast about whether his training over fences, because he'd been penciled in to go novice chasing this year, whether that jump training will have improved his hurdling, because he was quite sketchy with his hurdling last year, or whether it would made him have even less regard for his hurdles. But it actually did the former. He jumped far better. Jumped a little bit big, but he jumped clean. He barely made a mistake on his way round. The handicap has put him up now £5 to a mark of 157, beating Lump Sum, who ran a really solid race. He's gone up £1 to a mark of 144. He beat him 8 lengths. He beat him comfortably. But I do think that social media, or racing social media, as can be its wont, did get a little bit carried away in the immediate aftermath. Make no mistake, this is a really classy 4-year-old, but he's got an official rating of 157. He's got upwards of £10 to find to be a legitimate champion hurdle winner in my book, when you take in the likes of State Man and Lossiemouth, who will come to you later, and of course Constitution Hill, who by all accounts, is still alive and well, and I'm certainly in the camp of not wanting to give up on him too soon. So what would I do as Sir Gino? I can't imagine Nicky Henson's going to give me a ring, but if he did, I would love to see them go back onto their original plan and go chasing, because we've seen that at fairly short notice he was able to adapt back down to hurdles. So if they found they got to Christmas and they didn't have a Christmas hurdle contender, or if they got to Cheltenham and didn't have a champion hurdle contender, he could seamlessly drop back over hurdles, and actually maybe going with fences will improve and keep improving his jumping. But I think the Arkle picture still looks quite wide open. He's clearly a classy horse. He's a strong traveller. He's a good jumper now, and I'd ideally love to see him go back over fences, where, of course, to start off his campaign, he would get that valuable 4-year-old allowance. The Ferryhouse action on Saturday largely focused around 2 performers from the Willie Mullins yard. For me, in the form of Impair A Pass, who won his beginner's chase over 2 mile, 5.5 furlongs very nicely indeed. Quite a keen horse when winning the Ballymore Novices Hurdle 2 seasons ago. I was really impressed how he switched off this race. He lobbed through the race in 3rd or 4th, popped the majority of his fences, and there was just a moment jumping the second last, running down to the last, whether you wondered whether he was actually going to pick up. But with just a fairly easy squeeze from Paul Townend, he jumped onto the bridle, got to the front very easily and scooted away. It was a race that was sadly marred by the loss of 203 for Gordon Elliott and the McNeil yard, and another leg break for Jack Kennedy, making it 6 legs breaks now before his mid-20s. That's really unfortunate and very damaging for Gordon Elliott's yard. He is a class rider, but Impair A Pass could not have been more impressive. The fact he's starting to relax now, this was 2 mile, 5.5 furlongs. I'm sure here 3 miles will be in his range. I think he's a really exciting addition to the novice ranks, and I can't see them taking him back in trip, but I can see them now stretching him up in trip, given how nicely he relaxed here. And then another horse making his debut for Willie Mullins in the Joe Donnelly colours, the yellow and black checks, was Ante-Post. He was 2 from 2 in France when trained by Arnaud Shai. He came over to Willie Mullins last year. They couldn't get him ready to run on the track, so he ran here with a lack of Irish experience in this 4-year-old hurdle, a grade 3. Travelled beautifully through the race. He wore a hood. He's clearly quite a free-going horse, but he didn't look too uncontrollable here, and then swept to the front going down to the last and cleared away. He's been given a bit of a headache now as to quite how they divvy up these 2 mile hurdlers. They've got State Man in the same colours. They've also got Lossiemouth, who we'll mention shortly. In the immediate aftermath, and it's always dangerous to listen to Willie Mullins straight after races, they suggest that he might go to the international hurdle at Cheltenham. He's got a bit to find yet, but I was impressed by what he did here, and I think he could be another interesting addition to the 2 mile hurdle picture this season. Sunday in Ferryhouse and Ireland was a bit of a muddle, really, in the graded novice races. Toon Servator landed the Royal Bond for Willie Mullins. He certainly didn't look the first string on jockey bookings. Danny Mullins doing the riding there, but they went fairly slow early on. That meant they finished in a bit of a heap and it turned into a bit of a sprint. I don't think that was to the advantage of Romeo Coolio, who finished runner-up. Certainly wasn't to the advantage of Bellocchio, who didn't jump all that well. Neither did Sea of Sands, the other Willie Mullins runner with Patrick Mullins on board, but it turned into a dash. It's a form line I wouldn't want to take too literally. But what I think it does suggest is that Romeo Coolio is not perhaps the top notcher that Gordon Elliott hoped he was, because horses of that calibre tend to be able to win however the race plays out, and he wasn't able to show the gears to go with Toon Servator. The one thing to point out with Toon Servator is that he won this as a novice, but he won his first novice in February, so he'll lose his novice status before the likes of the Spring Festival. So the Supreme, that type of race, he wouldn't be eligible, and I have seen him priced up in some markets for that, so don't get caught out by that. He cannot run in the Supreme Novices Hurdle. I'd perhaps be keen to give Romeo Coolio another go, but like I said, I am a bit disappointed that he didn't have the tactical speed here to be able to cope with this sort of test. And it might be that they look to go up in trip with him. He was runner-up in last year's Champion Bumper, and generally the Champion Bumper does tend to produce staying type of horses. The Drinmore Chase was the graded novice chase on the card, and it was won by, again, another second string, the Gordon Elliott trained Croke Park. Sam Ewing in the saddle. Firefox was sent off a short price favourite. He jumped soundly, but he might just become a bit of a tripless horse. They've gone up in trip here because they felt he lacked the speed for 2 miles. but I'm not sure he saw this out all that well. Again, another race that was run quite slowly through the early sectionals. Sam Ewing did a really good job of running his own fractions. He was on a confirmed stay. He ramped it up from some way out, and I think that took Firefox to a place he didn't really want to be under Keith Donahue. You could see Keith Donahue didn't know whether to try and take the gap up the rail or wait. Ended up perhaps doing neither. So maybe Firefox is a horse you'd give another chance to, but I think he's probably just short of the required calibre for an Arkle, and he certainly isn't going to stay the 3-mile trip of the Browns advisory chase. Hartwood, he was my selection in the race. I was a touch disappointed with him. I'd have liked to have seen his experience put to better use, and it might be that he's better actually dropping down into handicaps. So my conclusion from what I hope would be a slightly enlightening Sunday at Fairyhouse is twofold, really. I think, firstly, when you factor in Mystical Power failing to perform in the Fighting Fifth at Newcastle on the Saturday, then you take in the likes of Firefox on Sunday. Perhaps the Supreme Novice form from last year isn't working out all that well. Slade Steele has already been beaten on his chasing debut, and also I'm just not sure that this year's Irish crop of novices, both in the chasing ranks and in the hurdling ranks, are all that scary. Yes, they're clearly a very talented bunch, but normally by this stage, we've got an absolute monster that's appeared that's scaring everyone in the UK into looking for alternative targets. And actually, at the moment, I think the balance, certainly in the novice hurdle ranks, is split fairly evenly between the UK and Ireland. Willie Mullins, of course, hasn't run all that many horses. It's been quite well publicised that his gallop is far more effective when the rain comes. He can do more work with them then, and certainly one or two of his have needed the run. So I'd be expecting to see plenty of his horses out now through December into January, particularly over the Christmas period. And that picture might well change because we know he's got plenty of ammunition to unleash yet. But as things stand at the moment, you know, Ireland dominated the novice wins at the Cheltenham Festival last year. I'm not so sure it'll be quite the same this year, and it might give a little bit of hope to some of the UK trainers who've rather a bloodied nose over the last 3 or 4 seasons at Cheltenham. The final race of the day from Fairyhouse that I focused on was the Hatton's Grace hurdle, which saw the much anticipated class of Lossiemouth and Ante-Post. Lossiemouth, of course, winning the Mares Hurdle at the Cheltenham Festival last year, Ante-Post winning the Stayers Hurdle, and was already a dual winner of the Hatton's Grace. Lossiemouth absolutely swept him apart in this. She travelled brilliantly through the race, if a little bit keenly at times, but in part that was down to this being her seasonal return, but also a very clever bit of placing by Gordon Elliott to run Maxim, who I think was in there as a bit of a spoiler. He sat on her girth the whole way, always encouraging her to race a little bit over keen. And in hindsight, it might be that the mistake 4 out worked to her advantage. It meant it took her away from Maxim. Paul Townend was able to get a bit of a breather into her. She got back onto the bridle very quickly, swept round the home bend, went past Beacon Edge, Ante-Post, like they were going backwards, like they were a very moderate horse indeed, and they're not. Flew the last really quick and slick over the last and lengthened away under minimal urgence from Paul Townend. She's now been given a mark of 160 by the IHRB handicapper. She'd get a £7 mare's allowance, obviously in open company, which would take up to 167, which is just £2 shy of the 169 that Stateman finds himself on. But I think you could argue that Stateman doesn't run to his rating around Cheltenham. I'm not sure it's his favourite track. Unusually for Willie Mullins, he suggested afterwards that the Champion Hurdle would be her target. He normally likes to leave things quite late, keep his cards quite close to his chest, but he said that this is her target. That's where she's going to aim, and she would only end up in the Mares Hurdle if something went wrong in either of her prep races for that. I think Paul Townend will have his eyes on riding her. I think he's fairly clear that she's a talented mare. She'll certainly improve for dropping back 2 miles. She's got loads of pace, and Cheltenham is definitely her track, whereas I think Stateman slightly underperforms. Of course, she would still potentially have to contend with Constitution Hill. He's rated 175. She'll have to find a bit more. Of course, we have to see him come back, but I'm firmly in the camp that you shouldn't be forgetting him. He's only had a few niggles. He's not had any serious injuries, just had a catalogue of injuries that meant he's been kept away from the track, but only for just over a year. So while some I know like to think I've lost my senses, I'm still a big believer in Constitution Hill and Nicky Henderson bringing him back. And as racing fans, that's the clash we should want to see, is Constitution Hill versus Lossiemouth at the Cheltenham Festival. But the curveball that Willie Mullins has thrown into the mix is that he might look to go to the Christmas Hurdle with Lossiemouth, which is where, of course, Constitution Hill might make his return. I do wonder whether that's a little bit of gamesmanship, trying to frighten Nicky Henderson into doing something different, because I'm sure Nicky Henderson won't want to take on a race-fit Lossiemouth with a half-fit or not fully fit Constitution Hill. So maybe Willie Mullins is trying to get Nicky Henderson to revert to plan B, which of course works to Mr. Mullins' advantage. So Christmas could be really interesting. Lossiemouth or Constitution Hill in the Christmas hurdle, or potentially both. That would, I think, take centre stage on the King George card. So that was the weekend that's just been. We'll now move into Handicap Movers and Shakers, horses going up or down in the handicap, or indeed getting new marks. And the first one I want to focus on is going all the way back to last Monday, and it was the returning Dr. Ken. He returned after 600 days off the track to finish runner-up in a 2-mile 4 handicap chase around Kempton. Looked quite a competitive race on paper. When I was looking at it, he was actually one of the first ones I took off my list. I thought he'd probably need the run. This trip would certainly be sharp enough for him. He was a 2-mile 7 furlong winner round Taunton, but he's gone up £2 finishing runner-up here off a mark of 130, up to a mark of 135. I was quite impressed with what he did here. He stuck at it. He seemed to jump really well for Sean Bowen. He's been off so long that his last pilot was actually Aidan Coleman. Sean Bowen and him seem to get on really well. He'll improve with his step up in trip. He does want a sound surface, so it might just be that he now struggles a little bit if he doesn't get his conditions. But going up in trip off a mark of 135, that Taunton win has worked out quite well from 2 years ago. I do think Dr. Ken is a horse that can still win races for Ollie Murphy. Also winning on the Kempton card, and winning very easily indeed, was Kabral Du Mathan for Paul Nicholls. Freddie Ginger riding him in a conditional jockey's handicap hurdle. He travelled brilliantly through the race, if somewhat a bit over keen, but he arrived there pulling double, jumped the second last, got to the front, cleared away, maybe idled, maybe got a little bit tired after the last, but he was still a very impressive wide margin winner. He's gone up £8 now to a mark of 131. I actually covered this race for Racing TV, and I marked him up as the most likely winner, said that I thought he was a graded horse in the making, and nothing I saw here about this 4-year-old has forced me to change my mind. I'm very impressed by him. He has got to learn to race in a bit more of a relaxed manner. If he does so, I think he'll stay further, but for now I expect to see him be kept to 2 miles. I don't think this new mark will stop him, and he's certainly a horse that should be going into your notebook. And then the final horse of interest going up in the handicap this week is Skycutter for Dan Skelton. He finished runner-up at Wetherby over 2 miles in a handicap chase. He was a pretty consistent handicap hurdler last year, running up to marks of about 120. And I think he just found the ground here a little bit lively. He got outpaced between 3 out and 2 out, then started to rally going towards the last and finished very strongly after the last. He's gone up £2 now to a mark of 122, but he will be better when getting soft ground underfoot. His very best form has come on soft ground. The rain is starting to arrive now, so we're going to get that. There'll be plenty of racing through Christmas. There's a 2-day fixture at Wetherby. I would be very surprised indeed if you didn't see Skycutter perhaps turn up back at Wetherby on soft ground, maybe with Tristan Durrell on board, claiming a few pound off his back. And I think Skycutter is an interesting horse through the winter months when there's give underfoot. Horses going down the handicap now, and for the first episode of this series, actually, there's a few going down the handicap that have caught my eye. The first is Zambezi Fix for Welsh trainer Bernard Llewellyn. He's down £2 to a mark of 123. He again ran in that race at Kempton behind Kabral Du Mathan. Zambezi Fix is a much better horse on slow ground. I think the good to ground round Kempton would have been far too lively for him, but he made pretty good effort under a conditional jockey, made fairly slow progress up the home straight. He's been dropped £2 to a mark of 123. He's previously won off a mark of 121. He's very good around Chepstow, and he's very good on slow ground. He's certainly going to get those conditions in the coming weeks, and Zambezi Fix is a horse that's fully on my radar through the Christmas period. The Bernard Llewellyn yard are not a big yard, but they're very adept at lining one up when they feel they've got a handicap mark that's workable. So Zambezi Fix has certainly gone into my tracker. We've already mentioned Khalif de Burle winning at Newbury on Friday in that novice handicap chase. Making his chasing debut and making a good effort was Tapley, racing off a mark of 126. He'd won a couple of handicap hurdles last year. This was his chasing debut. He jumped soundly in the main. He made a mistake at the first fence up the home straight just as the race was picking up tempo. That put paid to his chance, but he made fairly steady progress up the home straight. The handicap has seen it fit to drop him £3 now, down to a mark of 123. I think that mark is a winnable mark for him. He's won off 122 over hurdles. He seems to be at his best on a slightly sharper track as well. Places like Plumpton and Fakenham away tends to do most of his winning. And provided the ground doesn't get too soft, this is a horse that does need good ground. So it might be that his conditions are gone for him. But put him in your tracker for a long-term target. Tapley, I think can certainly win a couple of little races around sharp tracks on good ground for trainer Susie Smith. Sticking to Newbury for the next two, and the first is Johnnywho, who had absolutely no answer for the Jukebox Man in the John Frankham Novices Chase. I was a bit disappointed. He arrived here with race fitness and chasing experience advantage over the Jukebox Man, having won very impressively at Carlisle on his chasing debut, but he had absolutely no answer for the Jukebox Man here. Maybe the ground was a bit quick, but I think actually the conclusion I've drawn is he's not quite as good as I hoped he'd be. He's dropped down a pound now to a mark of 143. He'll stay further than this 2 mile 4 furlong trip. He'll certainly handle slower ground, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if in the colours of JP McManus with the O'Neill yard, if he doesn't look to target better grade handicap chases. Now, his jumping was pretty sound. He pecked on landing at 1, but that wasn't really a jumping error. It was just a mistake in getting his legs organised on landing. I wouldn't hold that against him, and he does have the look of a handicap chaser to follow going forwards off a mark of 143. Another horse now. Now, this could be a little bit of a cliff horse for me. I actually tipped him up for the Badger Beers chase on the SBK betting podcast. He ran no sort of race at all there, but it was a very strange race where the winner and the second went very hard from the front. Is Lord Baddesley. He's now with Anthony Honeyball, previously with Chris Gordon. He ran in the 2 mile 4 furlong handicap chase won by Le Patron. This was on quick enough ground. This is a short enough trip for him, but again he made pretty good late progress, as he had done last year in the Sir Peter O'Sullivan chase over 2 mile 6. Tried to make all the running on this occasion, got outpaced jumping 3 out, looked like he was going to weaken and eventually tail off, but he rallied to good effect. He was closer again at the finish than he'd been at any point over the final 3 fences. I'm sure that Newbury is his track, and I'm certain off a mark now of 126 having been dropped a pound, he is a well-handicapped horse for all that he's quite a frustrating horse to follow. So I'm putting him in my tracker. I'd fully understand if you don't want to go over the cliff with me, but I do think Lord Baddesley has got a decent pot in him this season. And then the final one coming down in the handicap was Galia Des Liteux. Now, she was the selection of both Tom Collins and Jess Stafford in the Coral Gold Cup on Saturday. Unfortunately for her, the rain didn't arrive. The ground conditions were far too quick, and she struggled, really. She struggled to ever really get into a rhythm, and that forced her to weaken over this trip, proving that often when they weaken, it's not a lack of stamina, it's an inefficient use of energy. She was all the time a gear higher than she ever wanted to be. She could never really relax. That put paid to her stamina. She definitely stays further than this. She's down 2 pounds now to a mark of 142. That's the same mark. She was very narrow runner-up in the classic chase at Warwick last season, where she was staying on hand over fist over that 3 mile 5 furlong trip on soft ground. She's got an entry in the Coral Welsh Grand National. I think that's where she'll go next. That looks a very reasonable target for me. Stiff track there, 3 mile 6 furlong on what is normally slow ground, could well suit, and she's certainly back on an attractive looking mark now. I'm a big advocate of taking interest in racing throughout the week, not just the high-class stuff at the weekend, and this next horse definitely falls into that category. She's a new entry, and it's Jukebox Annie for Claire Hitch. She's got an opening mark of 94. She finished 4th in her latest novice hurdle at Taunton. That was a strange race. 4 went off like scalded cats. 3 were able to maintain the pace. She sat off the pace and basically headed the closing pack. Made pretty good progress late in the day. She was beaten around 20 lengths, but it was a race that slightly fell apart. She'll certainly stay further. She's not up to anywhere near the calibre of the 3 that finished in front of her. But prior to that, she had won a fairly muddling little race over that same course and distance of 2 miles and half a furlong at Taunton, staying on late in the day, having almost thrown the race away by balking at the second last hurdle. She arrives now on a mark of 94. I think she'd be interesting around Taunton. She'll stay a bit further than 2 miles and half a furlong. And in mares only handicaps, I think a mark of 94 for Claire Hitch, Jukebox Annie can certainly win a little race, or maybe even 2. And to finish with, in this section, there's 4 non-movers this week. The first of which is Rickety Bridge for Nicky Richards. He ran in a conditionals handicap hurdle over 3 miles at Doncaster. And much as I don't like to say it against conditionals because they are learning their trade, he was given a fairly moderate ride. He was given far too much to do. He absolutely flew her over the final 2 hurdles. He ballooned the last hurdle, which was a big nod to the amount of energy he had left in the tank, was never nearer than at the finishing line. He stays on a mark of 93. His conditional rider will have learned plenty from this. I would have no issue whatsoever in backing this partnership again in a similar grade of race, and he certainly looks like he's on a mark from which he can strike this winter for trainer Nicky Richards. The next one is more of a reminder, really. He should already be in your tracker, as I've put him up already in this series. Idy Wood. He ran at the weekend, stays on a mark of 126 behind Khalif de Burle over 2 miles at Newbury. That just wasn't a suitable trip at all. The ground would have been too lively, the trip would have been too short, but he remains on an unchanged mark of 126, and I'm convinced that when he goes up in trip and gets a little bit of softer ground, he's still a well-handicapped horse over fences, particularly given how well his novice hurdle form has worked out already this season. Probably the biggest eye catcher for this week is Salver. He stays on a mark of 143 after finishing 4th off top weight in the Jerry Fielden at Newbury. I was surprised he ran. I was convinced they'd take him out. This is a horse whose all of his best form is on soft, even heavy ground. Ground at Newbury was certainly riding on the lively side, certainly no slower than good to soft. He ran a very taking race, staying on pretty nicely in the closing stages in what looked a very competitive race. He stays on a mark of 143. The Gary Moore and Josh Moore yard, as it is now, is starting to hit a bit of form. Had a double at Newbury on Friday. The rain is coming, which is going to give this horse his conditions. I think he looks as near to a certainty as you can get to be a winner in a handicap hurdle on slow ground over 2 miles next time out. And if the Betfair hurdle came up soft ground, he's already proven here that he'll handle track and conditions. I think he's just a really talented horse. He had very good juvenile hurdle form. He clearly has carried that into this season. And on ground that wasn't to his liking, I thought that was a very big run on Saturday in the Jerry Field. And so Salver, off a mark of 143, if you only listen to one horse this week from this section, make sure it's him. Put him into your tracker and be ready to follow him when the ground turns soft. My selection in the Coral Gold Cup on Thursday's podcast was Victtorino for the informed Venetia Williams and Charlie Deutsch. And sadly, if you followed me in, you could pretty much discount him after 2 fences. He jumped very slowly through the early stages. He took a long time to warm up. And my attention had switched to the actual race result and the Can-Do Kid and Broadway Boy fighting it out. So I was surprised as anyone to see him flashing home into 3rd, rallying very strongly up the home straight, having been virtually tailed off, turning in. It's a case of what could have been, really. If he'd have laid up a little bit better in the early stages, he might well have been a competitive horse. But he stays on a mark of 143. He is somewhat of an ascot specialist. Both his wins in the UK have come at ascot. But I didn't see anything at Newbury that suggested going left-handed was the issue. It just looked to me to get taken off his feet on this quite lively ground in this competitive race in the early stages, and that put paid to his chance. So I think I'd be happy to follow him in again off a mark of 143. Certainly if he went back to ascot, that would be a boost. Slower ground, I think, would help him. And he clearly looks like he's going to stay further than this. So there's some pretty good staying chases around ascot, 3 mile, 3 mile 2. Victtorino, I'm not going to give up on him just yet, for all that it was slightly disappointing effort through the early stages in the Coral Gold Cup Trophy on Saturday. So that's Handicap Movers and Shakers done with. But before I go, I wanted to flag your attention to what I think is a decent Ante-Post bet in the form of Madara for the December Gold Cup, which comes a week on Saturday at Cheltenham. Last seen finishing 4th in the Paddy Power Gold Cup, where he effectively ran off a mark of 141 because he was a pound out of the handicap. He's got an official rating of 140. I was interested to see what adjustment the handicapper would make to his mark for that very decent run. And the truth is, he's not touched him at all. He leaves him on 140, which I think is incredible when you factor in that on the old course at Cheltenham, he was ridden out the back. He was ridden very patiently. He was pretty much the only one to make inroads that came from off the pace. Traditionally, as we see year on year, to win on the old course, you have to be up with the pace early. He wasn't. He ran without his usual cheek pieces. He ran without his usual tongue tie. Everything about this screamed to me that this was a sighter as to whether he would stay this trip. He'd stayed this trip previously when in France. His 2 wins, formerly with Sophie Leach in the UK, had come over 2 miles at Cheltenham and at Leopardstown Christmas Festival. He stayed this trip very nicely indeed. I would expect to see the cheek pieces go back on. I expect to see the tongue tie go back on. Harry Skelton will jump aboard. They only have 2 entrants at the moment, one of which is Midnight River, but he ran in the Coral Gold Cup on Saturday, so I think he's a very unlikely runner. And he's 9-1. I think he's an outstanding prospect at this time. I expect him to go off a fairly short price favourite come the day. Switching to the new course is going to suit him. Harry Skelton taken back on board. Like I said, the tongue tie and the cheek pieces going on, which is bound to see him take a step forward. And everything looks like a mark of 140 seriously underestimates his ability. So that's it for another episode of Millers Movers. Hopefully a few interesting handicap moves and shakers for you to get into your tracker. A good review of the weekend that's just been, and of course an Ante-Post bet for the December Gold Cup at Cheltenham. I'll be back same time next week, where we'll review the action from Sandown, including the Tingle Creek, and of course keeping abreast of all the action from Ireland